Hello, everybody, and welcome to a podcast of Miss Fiara Speaks. On today's podcast, I would like to dive into the conversation of black on black crime. Now, I know I'm supposed to have a podcast scheduled for Sunday about being black and seeing and experiencing racism. That conversation will still happen, but I live in Chicago, and this weekend was a very violent weekend in my city, and I saw a lot of conversations about black lives and whether or not black lives matter to black people. And when the news articles comes out or there is another victim of senseless violence, you see a lot of the rhetoric of where are the protesters, where are the marchers for this little girl? Why aren't people outraged like they were for George Floyd? Maybe if the assailant was white, there would be justice. And that is such a misconception. That is such a negative way to view this. A lot of people say that there's nothing being done in the city of Chicago, and I'm speaking for my city. I know Chicago is not the only city that is stricken with gun violence. So, but I don't live in those cities. I don't get my resources from those cities. I live in Chicago, so I can only speak for my city right now. People in Chicago are outraged about the gun violence and the gang violence. People in Chicago are doing everything that we can to give resources to the youth to try and prevent them from joining the streets, joining a life of violence, and to better our communities and our neighborhoods, to insinuate that black lives do not matter to black people, or to insinuate that black people are not doing anything to get justice for these victims is very uneducated, because a lot of people who say these things are not doing the research to say, hey, what are black people doing? Hey, what is available in the city to help these children not turn to a life in the streets? So today's conversation is going to be centered around educating my listeners on what systematic racism is, why the rhetoric of black on black violence is detrimental to the conversation, and what is available and what community programs and what activism is being done to try and put an end to senseless gun violence, senseless gang violence. It breaks my heart every time I see a child or a person or anybody lose their life due to gun violence. Do we need stricter gun reform? Yes. Do these children need better resources to be available to them to give them other opportunities and choices? Yes, we do. And there are programs out there. People may not know about it. People may not even take the time to look them up. But to hear people use the rhetoric that black lives don't matter to black people unless the assailant is white is very harmful, and it's very heartbreaking, because it overshadows all the work that is being done in these communities to try and lessen the number of victims and the number of children that are turning to a life of crime because they feel that they have no other choice. So, me being a black woman raised in the inner cities of Chicago, I went to neighborhood grammar schools and high school, but my parents sheltered my siblings and I from a lot of the things that were happening in the neighborhood. My parents dropped us off at school, picked us up from school every day. We weren't allowed to walk. We weren't allowed to leave the school buildings. Not to say that as kids we didn't test boundaries and we didn't try to do things that we were not allowed to do. But my parents did their best to shelter us from things that were happening, not just racism, but the violence that was happening in our neighborhood, in our community. But when we went to school, we heard about these things. I knew students who were, you know, left to deal with themselves in the summertime because their parents worked and there was nothing for them to do. They were left to entertain themselves or find something for them and their siblings to do. And it was a lot of outside time. And outside time can be dangerous when there's nothing productive and constructive for the children to do. But there were organizations and programs in place in our high school to try and give children an out, give children who were considered at risk something to do. But I was not exposed to these programs. Was not. Yes, I lived in the inner city. Yes, I went to a neighborhood school. Yes, I'm a black girl and I have four black brothers. But with the structure of our household, we were not, quote unquote, at risk. We were not the children who needed these resources. The children who needed these resources were children who did not have the same home structure or the same resources or the same parental income that my siblings and I were exposed to. So, on I debated with myself all day yesterday about how to positively and effectively get the message out about the stereotype in the harmful rhetoric of black on black crime without making it about me, because this is not my story. This is not, yes, I am a black person and I do know of resources and I have done work, but I know a young man by the name of Edward Ward who has always, always, always been an activist, not just about police brutality or racial injustices, but about systematic racism and about giving resources to black and brown children, especially men, being an advocate for their voices and saying, hey, I'm a black man. I lived in the inner city. I know what we need. And he has done the work. He has lived that life. So, and when I say live that life, I don't mean a life in the streets. I mean a life of combating the streets. I mean a life of doing better than what he had seen. So I am more than happy to share the platform that I have with my old high school academic rival, but also my friend, someone who I have watched over the years do the work. I have seen and witnessed Edward do the work that is needed and oftentimes questioned in our community. Where are the activists now? Is a lot of the rhetoric that I see in the comment section under posts about Chicago gun violence, Facebook posts that I see people questioning what is happening. Where are the advocacies? Where are the advocates? Where are the resources for black and brown children to prevent them from joining or turning to a life of violence? So without further ado, I would like to introduce Edward Ward, and I would just like for him to introduce himself.
My name is Edward Ward. I'm an activist in the city of Chicago. I graduated from DePaul University. There isn't really a title that I go by except my name. I believe that a lot of work in our communities need to be done, but I more so believe that a lot of work in this country needs to be done.
As I stated earlier, Edward and I both went to the same high school, so we grew up in the same neighborhood basically. And Edward, I just want you to explain to the listeners what are some stereotypes and circumstances you had to basically overcome, or stereotypes that you had to tear down on your journey to where you are today.
Living in the inner city, as a black man, there are quite a few stereotypes and challenges I had to push back against. There's this expectation that my success would be rooted in either being an athlete or being a rapper in the music industry. And I've never wanted to be in the music industry. I've never wanted to be a rapper. In fact, I wanted to be involved in politics, and I wanted to be involved as a lawyer as well. And so here it is, I'm preparing to go to law school, and I'm also involved in the political arena. And so this is a way I'm pushing back against that stereotype. There are other stereotypes that I'm extremely aggressive and violent because I am a black man. Quite the opposite. I've been involved with organizations where we do violence prevention. And so I've been involved in just, community oriented organizations that really factor into the notion of feeding communities as opposed to starving the communities. And so the goal was always to build the community up and never tear the community down. So again, in that way, pushing back against those other stereotypes and really being mindful of my sartorial choices. Not every black man wears their pants sagging, or not every black man dresses like they're in a gang, but that we are a collection of diverse people, right? That each of us have different perspectives, that each of us have our own minds and make our own decisions, and being mindful of that and proving that, right? That I can make my own decisions. There was the expectation that I wouldn't necessarily go to college because of the conditions in which I grew up in, but I was the first in my family to go to college. And so it's really about pushing back against those stereotypes. These stereotypes have about as much power as we give it. And if we give it no power, then it's rendered useless.
I could not agree more. I know as a young girl growing up in the inner cities of Chicago, the main stereotype that I had to, excuse me, fight against was being young and pregnant. It was that stereotype that African American girls, African American teenagers were just baby making machines. And it was not hard to fight that stereotype, but you grow up and you see shows such as Teen Mom that glorifies teenage pregnancies, or give, TV time to teenage girls who are pregnant, but none of them looked like me. But yet and still, the stereotype that black girls and teenagers were getting pregnant at an early age and using the welfare system and taking advantage of the welfare system was such a wrong and misleading stereotype. And it was something that, as a black teenager, child, young girl, it was something that you not necessarily had to fight against, but it was a stereotype that you didn't want to be lumped or categorized in. So it was just, it was, it's not something that you actively have to fight, right? It's like if you were in a grocery store and you with your younger sibling, people are going to naturally assume that, okay, that's a teenage girl, that's a child, maybe that's her child. Because I'm African American, it's going to be easily assumed that the child that I am with is mine and not a relative or a sibling. So it's something that's always on the conscience of a young girl, of making myself, not making myself a stereotype. But that is a conversation for another day. Edward, I want to get back to you in trying to give people the understanding and a better look into what resources we had in our high school, what programs we had in our high school, what programs and resources were you involved in, and if or how it basically saved you. And I'm using quotations, but you can't see them. But I just want to give my listeners an insight on what prevented you, or what programs were in place that helped prevent you from being indulged in the street life.
There were quite a few programs that helped me stay off the street. There was After School Matters, Debate, Academic Decathlon, Black Ensemble Theater. So there were a few programs that I was really involved in. I was one of the students who wanted to be involved in everything. And so in high school, these programs were readily available.
Now, I want to just dive into the conversation of systematic racism, what that means, in basically the definition of systematic racism.
Systemic racism is kind of the normalizing of certain behaviors against certain groups of people based on their race. More specifically, racism in itself is prejudices coupled with power, right? So not only do we not like you because of the color of your skin, but now we have the power to put laws and legislation and other rules in place to stop you from advancing or progressing in society.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where the racism piece comes in, right? And institutionalized and systemic racism, it comes in the form of chattel slavery, one of the most blatant forms of racism there is. It comes in the form of Jim Crow through the implementation of black codes that prevented black folks from having the rights to vote. It comes in the form of Plessy versus Ferguson that ruled on the notion of separate but equal, when separate was in fact inherently unequal. It comes in the forms of lynchings from the KKK. It comes in the forms of police brutality when they're policing black communities. Day in and day out. Systemic racism ultimately creates this identity for people of color, more specifically, creates an identity for black people that associate them and deem them criminals as opposed to regular citizens in the country. Now, we have an institution, a legal institution that is set up and goes on the motto of innocent until proven guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Systemic racism puts black folks in a position to be guilty until proven innocent. In any other legal matter, it would be the burden of proof for the accusers to prove why certain people or the accused are guilty. But in this case, the black folk who are accused in many of the crimes are guilty until proven innocent. And the burden of proof is on black people to prove their innocence, even after you get killings. Of black people by the police department, you look at an indictment of the black person's character, and it's you ask questions like, well, what did they do to deserve being killed? Sandra Bland, in her situation, people said, well, she should have complied with the officer and she shouldn't have gotten so aggressive. Eric Garner, people say that he shouldn't have been selling cigarettes on the street because it was against the law. Michael Brown, people say he was a big guy, and before he got shot, I'm sure he robbed somebody at some convenience store. Trayvon Martin, people say, well, maybe he shouldn't have been in the neighborhood. And so there's always these indictments of the character of black folk in the country. And that is a direct result of institutional or systemic racism that says because of the color of your skin, you are inherently a threat. And there are these laws in place now that will protect the people who target people of color or who target more specifically black people. The law that protected George Zimmerman was the Stand Your Ground law, but we know that the same Stand Your Ground law in Florida doesn't apply equally across the board. So systemic racism is having these prejudices coupled with power in certain systems that allow you to maneuver throughout and impact the lives of other folks in the country who happen to be of a darker persuasion.
Thank you for so eloquently explaining what systematic racism is. Now, I would like to dive into the conversation of black on black violence.
Black on black crime is a myth. It doesn't really exist. It is a tactical talking point used to divert the attention away from the state sanctioned violence committed against black people in the country. It is a way of changing the conversation into a notion of respectability politics. When you ask the question about black on black crime, it is almost to suggest that black people are targeting black people because black people are black, right? And it's also a way of suggesting that violence among black folk is inherent in their nature, right? We ignore the notion of white on white crime or Asian on Asian crime or Latino on Latino crime. These are titles, if you will, of crime that we've never truly heard of, or even titles of crime that we never really involve ourselves with, because that notion of crime does not exist. It is a crime of demographic. More black folk commit crimes against other black folk because they live around other black folk. The same way 82 or so percent of murders committed by white people are done to other white people, because most white people in the country live around other white people. So it's a crime of demographic. It is not a crime of race. And when we say black on black crime, we make it a crime of race, and it does a disservice to what the real issues are. And we constantly refer to the notion of black on black crime, or crime in black communities, when it comes to, again, state-sanctioned violence against black people. But there's a difference between black crime and state-sanctioned crimes, or state-sanctioned murders, right? When a black person commits a crime, uh, if a black man kills another black man, that black man goes to jail. If a police officer kills a black man, that police officer is deemed an officer just doing his job, and he's justified. There's a blue wall of silence that gets in the way to prevent you from actually apprehending the police officer for brutality, or your use. I want people to understand that black on black crime does not exist. That when they engage in an argument about black on black crime, they're just changing the conversation from what the real issues are. I want people to understand that there are other organizations within the black community that are fighting to combat black on black crime. Let's look at the pictures, right, of the young people on posters where you say, "Don't shoot, I want to grow up." I mean, growing up, that was everywhere. So I want people to understand that things are being done around the clock to solve for the violence in the community, but also the violence of the state.
It is very disheartening being a Chicago native and hearing and seeing the rhetoric that black people don't care about black lives unless a white person kills them. That black people are doing nothing in the neighborhoods or in the community to try and stop and prevent this black on black crime. Living in Chicago, being a Chicago native, having family and friends who live in Chicago in these neighborhoods, I know firsthand that the problem starts with giving our youth something constructive to do. The problem starts with having resources available for parents and their children to keep these kids active during the long months of the summer, after school. And it does not always have to be sports. Knowing my friend Edward, and knowing that he had debate and drama club and other activities at his exposure, is what kept him busy. Basically, kids need to stay busy, because if they don't, then what? Most of the parents of these children are working hard. They're working parents who have to go to work and don't have money for daycare, or don't have money for the YMCA, or don't have money for a swim class or anything, or a camp to keep their children occupied during these summer months. So you have to ask yourself, what is in place to give these children an out? What is in place to give these children something other than? And for people to say nothing is being done, for people to assume that we aren't outraged about the senseless killings and violence in Chicago, is very disheartening, because you're not doing your research. You aren't doing the research to see who is protesting and trying to stand against gun violence and gun control, who is trying to stop this war on drugs, who is out here doing the groundwork to save our youth, to save these babies and give them an out. Give them something to do. Show them that there is more to this world and more to society than what is in their neighborhood. You have children who are living in poverty, living and breathing in poverty. Poverty is all that they know. And they think the way to get out, the way to get money, the way to get quick money is by selling drugs. And when you start down the path of selling drugs, it opens a whole new world and a whole new door of troubles. There are plenty of black men and women and people in general in the cities of Chicago that is doing their very best and doing the tedious work of trying their best and trying their hardest to get these children something constructive to do. So, I will start by listing and naming a couple of projects that I simply Googled and that I know to be available to the quote unquote at risk youth of the city. So there's a Dovetail project where they give African American fathers ages 17 to 24 the skills and support they need to be better fathers for their children and better men for their community. They offer schooling, tutoring, as well as GED completion tutoring to help these fathers and to help these men know that there is a better way, to give these men a community of saying, hey, we know that you might not have had this positive male role model in your life, but you can stop this generational curse. You can be that present, active, and great father to your child, regardless if you had that great male father figure in your life. There's also the West Side Cultural Foundation. And this is a nonprofit organization. It was established back in 2015 and it creates cultural and educational outlets for youth, adults, and seniors on the west side of Chicago, such as the Chicago West Side Music Festival. So we know that people get bored, people look for things to do, people look for programs and activities that they can just join. And that's a program that's not just for children, it's for adults as well, to give people something to do, to give people an out. There's also the Chicago Urban League, which gives economic, educational, and social resources to African Americans and promote strong, sustainable communities through advocacy, collaboration, and innovation. So to have in a program that gives resources to the people in the neighborhood to say, hey, here is educational resources, here is social resources, here is economic resources, because systematic racism is not just an issue of the government is against the people. It is socially, do you know that there's therapists out there? Socially, do you know that there is ways to seek help, to help you through anything that you may be going through mentally? Because we do know that mental and physical disabilities are something that a lot of African Americans do not like to seek help about. So if you have a physical disability, maybe you have that I can do it on my own, I can fix myself without going to get the proper therapy, or you don't have the resources to go to therapy or get to therapy, or if you have suffered some kind of mental setback, or you have seen traumatic things or experienced any kind of trauma, there are social services out there to get you the therapy that you need. So having resources like this ready and available to African Americans is so important, as well as urban initiatives, which is an empowerment project for the youth to become community leaders through academic success, healthy living, social and emotional learning. Now, this is very important because in the African American community, it is almost, I'll say, frowned upon to be vulnerable, to be socially aware, because then you are being too emotional and you have your guard down. People have this misconception that you always have to have your guard up. You have to always be ready for whatever this world throws at you. So it leaves you less vulnerable than you need to be sometimes, or it makes you feel like you cannot be vulnerable because you have to have this war face on. And I will say that for myself because I experienced something very traumatic when I was 18, and I did not go seek help. I did not go to therapy, and I was mentally breaking down, and I was indulging myself in schoolwork. I was indulging myself in regular work. And I never took the step back to say, hey, Fiara, you need to go see a therapist because what happened to you was horrible and wrong, and now you are not okay. I felt that going to seek help made me weak. I thought that going to someone to talk about my feelings made me weaker than what I was. And I did not want to be weak. I did not want to be vulnerable anymore. So I felt I have my game face on, I have my war clothes on, and I'm not going to go seek help. I'm going to figure this out on my own. And I ended up snowballing into a huge mess. I was angry all the time. I was arguing and fighting my family who was doing nothing but trying to be there for me. I was shutting down without knowing that I was shutting down. And it wasn't until I got the great advice to go to the Women's Resource Center that was on my college campus and seek the help that I needed that I realized that seeking help does not make you crazy. It does not make you weak. It makes you strong because you were strong enough to realize, hey, I have a problem that I can't fix by myself. But again, all of that starts with the stigma and the stereotype that it's not okay to be, that it's not okay to not be okay. And it is okay to not be okay all the time. And so this is a great resource for people to know, hey, I can learn how to be socially and emotionally aware of myself and my surroundings. There's also community organizing family issues, which is a project to give power and voices to low income and working families in the inner city, as well as Girls for Science, which is a non for profit organization that addresses the lack of accessibility of quality science programs for female youth in Chicago land. So, like my friend Edward spoke about, he said there are many stereotypes for African Americans, right? So, that's either going to be a musician or athletic. There aren't many, if you say you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, you're standing against the grain, right? So to have an initiative and a project that say, hey, young girls, you can do more than what is laid out for you. You can be a scientist, even though we know that there are not a lot of science programs and classes at your exposure, and for you to just reach out and go to or pay for or whatever the issue is. Here is a program for you. Here's a program and here are resources to help you understand science and to be whatever you want to be. Let's give you the resources to say, hey, let me dive into science and see if this is something for me, which is great because girls and boys as well need things and need resources in our neighborhood and in our community that are other than the stereotypical football, basketball, baseball kind of things. I know for a fact that being academically ready. So my parents made sure that I was academically ready because they always told me that one thing that, and I'm going to be very raw and honest here, the one thing that a white man, quote unquote, because it's like the system that's set in place for black people, which is run by white men and women, that the one thing that the system cannot take from you is your education. They cannot take away your brain, right? So as long as you are smart and you are equipped with the knowledge to defend yourself, you will be okay. Your word is your power. A pen is mightier than the sword. As long as you have knowledge, you have power. So my parents made sure that they always pushed education, 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 education. So we were not involved in any extracurricular activities. So for the longest, I always thought I had no talents, right? I felt I wasn't artistic. I can't draw. I can't paint. I can't play an instrument. I can't play a sport because I am just not coordinated enough. In my 27 years of life, I have never been artistic. I have never been athletic, but I've always been academically strong. And I realized that I do have a talent. My talent is my voice. My talent is using the knowledge that I have and spreading that afar. educating as many people as I possibly can on what we as black and brown people feel and experience, and how some of the rhetoric that they use is detrimental to the fight, detrimental to our community, because it makes people feel like, oh, black lives don't matter to black people unless a white person kills them. It makes it seem as if we don't care about ourselves, as if we don't care about our community, as if we don't care about our city. Like I said, I love my city, I love my people, and I know that there are people out there every day doing the work and trying to better the neighborhoods and trying to better the communities and trying to better the circumstances that some of these children have or are born into. Give them resources, give them programs, give them positive outlets to saying, hey, we don't want you to be another number. We don't want you to be a statistic. We want you to be everything that you want to be. So we're going to give you resources. We're going to give you programs that are ready and accessible for you, because everybody can't afford the YMCA. Everybody can't afford park district camps. Everybody cannot afford, you know, a babysitter or a program to put their kids in on these long summer months. So yes, we do lose kids to the streets. We do lose kids and men and women to senseless gun violence. But there are programs and there are people out here every day doing the groundwork. So do not say that we don't care about each other, that we don't care about our own lives. So why do you? Because that is very problematic. You're basically saying and agreeing that black lives don't matter because you think that black people don't care about each other. So why should you? That's a problematic statement within itself. Black people obviously care about each other. But like my friend Edward said, it's all about proximity. White people kill white people every day, but I don't hear white on white violence or white on white crime. I don't hear Asian on Asian crime or Asian on Asian violence. I don't hear Japanese on Japanese violence or Mexican on Mexican violence or Hispanic on Hispanic violence. I only hear that rhetoric and I only hear those terms when it comes to black people to continue to lessen our value in this world, to continue to say, hey, they don't matter. Let's not save them. Instead of asking what can I do to help, you're continuing to paint this picture that black people don't care about each other. And that's not true. And that is not safe. Because what you're saying is black people are more dangerous. And that's continuing. That what you're saying is saying that black people are dangerous. They're dangerous to not only themselves, but if they're dangerous to themselves, they're dangerous to everybody else, which is why black people are always profiled, right? Black men are always stereotyped as drug dealers or thugs. For instance, with George Floyd, people instantly went to they criminalized him. They instantly went to his background. They instantly went to what he's ever did wrong in his past. They criminalized him to make his life matter less. Instead of researching and diving into the police officer that killed him and seeing that he also has had misconducts in the past, they criminalized the victim. They victimized the victim. Now that's like saying, when a woman comes out and say, hey, I was sexually assaulted, to say, what about women on women? Like if a woman comes out and say, hey, I was assaulted by a man, the whole Me Too movement, right? To say, hey, I was sexually assaulted by these men in power. For someone to come out and say, well, what about women on women sexual assaults? What about when a woman assaults another woman? Nobody cares about that. Nobody used that as an opposing argument when situations like that happen. Yes, as a woman, I know there are arguments in place when people say, well, she shouldn't have been wearing that. She shouldn't have been doing that. She should not have been. So victimizing the victim is across the board. And we will dive into that conversation a lot deeper and why that's problematic for women. But now I'm diving into the conversation of why it is problematic. Why it is problematic for people to assume that black lives don't matter to black people. Gangs typically don't kill another gang because that other person is black. If it's a black gang killing a black gang member, they are not killing each other because they're black. If it's an innocent bystander, that innocent bystander was not murdered because they were black. Now, I want to end this by saying Police officers are paid to protect and serve. Police officers are paid to protect and serve, not murder. Gang members are not paid. They're just humans making bad decisions, right? Based on circumstances in their life led them to making these bad decisions, taking someone's life senselessly. But we know if that person is found, tried, and convicted, they will be sentenced severely. But it's time after time that a black person is killed because they are black or targeted because they are black and no justice is served. Hence, Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman is still walking around free because he did not get sentenced. He did not get convicted. So justice was not served in the Trayvon Martin case. And George Zimmerman is not a police officer. He targeted a young black boy because of the color of his skin and killed him in cold blood and walked free. I know for a fact if that assailant, if George Zimmerman was a black man, he would have been arrested, crucified, and convicted. There would be no shadow of a doubt that he would have never seen the light of day again. He would have been convicted for the murder of Trayvon Martin if George Zimmerman was black. And that would, in like all instances of black on black crime or black on black violence, that we get justice when that person is found, when that person is tried before the court. Justice is typically served. But we can not continue to say, why don't black lives matter to black people when the assailant is black? Why is the gun violence in Chicago thriving as hard as it is, and why aren't there any protests or marches? Well, you don't see them because the media does not show them. The media is not recording these resources that the children are being given. The media is not at projects or not filming the programs that these children are going to try and save themselves from the street. The media is not showing the protests to saying, hey, put the guns down, don't shoot, these kids want to grow up. The media is not showing these events. So, of course, you're going to constantly see violence after violence and victim after victim and ask yourself what is being done. But if you're asking yourself that question and you're not doing the research, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're continuing to dismantle Black Lives Matter. You're continuing the process to say, hey, Black lives don't matter. You're continuing to show us that we don't matter because you're using rhetoric that is very detrimental to our movement. And to say Black lives don't matter to Black people is the ultimate disrespect because clearly Black lives matter to us, or we would not fight as hard. I would not be as passionate if another life in general, but specifically Black lives, did not matter to me. Black lives have and will always matter to me, regardless of who is behind the gun or who is behind the crime. But I cannot deny the fact that black and brown youth need better resources at their exposure to say, hey, I don't need to join a gang or stay in the streets to be productive. There are other things out there for me to do to get involved in. Because we know basketball only can take another, basketball camps can only have a certain number of people. Football camps can only have a certain number of kids. But there needs to be other programs at these children exposure to get them busy, to get them off the streets. Now, I listed a ton of projects and resources and organizations, and I will add them to the description box. I want to thank my friend Edward Ward for coming on today and having this conversation with us, because to hear this from an African American black male perspective is essential. We need to hear their voices. We need to know what saved him, what will continue to save more men and women from joining the streets, what will stop them from being quote unquote at risk youth. How can we save these at risk youth? Another program that is on the west side that did amazing work is Earth Remedies. Earth Remedies is a non-for-profit organization that give an array of resources to black and brown people. So they just did a project called Saving the West Side, to where they donated an amazing, I think it was close to $45,000 to black and brown businesses located on the west side of Chicago. But Earth Remedies also helps tutor, helps parents who need the resources to probably, let's say, pay a bill or put their children in camps. Earth Remedy is one of those resources that you can reach out to with a problem, and there is always a solution, whether it's psychological, whether it's social, emotional, financial, educational. Earth Remedies has a solution to your problem, and we need to promote and volumize resources like this for families and children to say, hey, there are people out there who want to help us. If the media portrayed and showed these resources just as heavily as they show the gun violence, I'm pretty sure there will be an outpour of people wanting to donate to continue to help these programs, as well as people wanting to join these programs. So I'm using the little voice that I have to try and give life to these positive resources, and to try and silence the damaging rhetoric that black people do not care about black lives unless the assailant is white. So I would like to end this podcast by saying, research. Figure out what you can do to either put your children in a better program or donate to help a child in need, to help save a child. If that's what you want to do, right? If you want to say black lives don't matter to black people, then do the research, and then you will see that black lives do matter to black people. And then put your money where your mouth is. Make sure that these children stay off the street. Let's be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. So I want to thank my listeners for listening to this podcast and joining me for another episode of Miss Fiara Speaks. I will be back on Sunday with the podcast of being black and seeing and experiencing racism in America. I will have my sister Teresa and nephew Trayvon on that podcast, because he's 11 years old and he has experienced a whole lot of racism in his young life, and I want to put volume to his stories. I want to give him a voice to say, hey, I'm 11. This happened to me. I'm pretty sure this is happening to other kids across America. Let's try and fix this problem. So I will be back on Sunday with that podcast, but I want to end this conversation today by saying, please do research. Please do not just continue to spread these harmful phrases that black lives don't matter to black people, and black on black crime is living and thriving in America, and nobody is talking about it, because we are talking about it. We are trying to fix this problem, but we need everybody to help, right? Black lives matter, black lives matter, black lives matter, regardless of who the assailant is. But if we address black on black crime, quote unquote, we will also have to address systematic racism. So let's end today's podcast with reading the description box, finding more resources in your neighborhood or in neighborhoods around Chicago that is trying to help save black and brown youth, and let's be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. Thank you for listening to Miss Fiara Speaks. I want to thank my friend Edward for joining us today, and I will be back for another podcast on Sunday. Thank you, and I hope you guys continue to have a beautiful week and do the work, because the resources are out there. All you have to do is Google it. When you have a question, just Google for the answer, or ask somebody for the answer, because these answers are out there. So let's not be a part of the problem. Let's be a part of the solution. And thank you for listening to Miss Fiara Speaks. Hope you guys have a beautiful rest of your week.